Hi everyone, in this second lecture I actually wanted to talk about some of the approaches to corporate social responsibility. Your text discusses two specific approaches, the altruistic approach as well as the economic approach. I'm actually going to discuss three different approaches. I'm going to separate essentially the economic approach, or I'm actually going to demonstrate an approach that is a almost compromise between the two. But let's look at what the text describes first. The first one being the altruistic social responsibility approach. And in this approach, really the motivation for the firm acting in a socially responsible manner is some type of moral or social obligation. The argument is that the firm, as a member of society, as a member, a social actor, that activity or that involvement in society mandates that the firm then act in a socially responsible manner to fulfill its obligation to society. So the motivation here is from a perspective of morality or social involvement. And you have probably read about the Iron Law made famous by Keith Davis, where he suggests that because society gives the firm, one, its resources, as well as purchases its products and services, and beyond that, grants the firm the legitimacy to operate in society. If the organization then chooses to not act in the best interest of society, then society will retract that legitimacy and actually hurt the well-being of the firm by either not providing it with its resources and or not purchasing its products and services. And that's called the Iron Law, if you will. And so that's where altruistic CSR comes from. The firms should actually behave in a socially responsible manner because of that socially and morally mandated obligation. Well, what are some of the repercussions or consequences of that perspective? Well, one is that because the firm doesn't cease to exist, or I should put it this way, the firm does not exist outside of society, then the firm can never absolve itself of that social or moral obligation. So the social or moral obligation, the need to act in a socially responsible manner never goes away because the firm is always inherently tied to society. Secondly, and very importantly, because that is the motivation, because the motivation is not based upon whether it's good for the firm, but more so whether it's good for society, then the firm's financial goals or the firm's financial outcomes are relatively subordinate to the outcomes or the needs of society. And so when the firm acts, the firm has to, in some regard, prioritize what is best for society, even if that activity jeopardizes the firm's financial outlook or financial well-being. And of course, because of that, it's where lots of individuals find a problem or are critical of the altruistic perspective on social responsibility, because it does not seem to complement or coincide well with the financial perspective or the financial wealth maximization dictum of organization. In fact, it can be in direct conflict with that, which doesn't necessarily serve the best interest of the organization. And some argue doesn't necessarily serve the best interest of society, because if the organization is seen as a vehicle through which society actually creates and generates wealth, then if the firm is doing anything that undermines that function, even something that seems to be well intended or something that seems to be morally upright, then that is ultimately going to hurt society. And so by the firm even trying to be charitable or the firm trying to be socially responsible, in the end it can leave society at a deficit rather than contribute. So that's the altruistic. Again, the motivation is that the firm has some type of social obligation because it's a social actor, and that social obligation, one, is always present because the firm is always society, and two, takes priority over the firm's own self-interest. The second approach the book describes is what they call the economic approach, and in some instances it's also described as the self-enlightened approach. And what that is that it sees social responsibility rather than a moral obligation actually as a means through which the firm can benefit financially. So it kind of turns CSR on its head a little bit. And rather than focusing on the social benefit of social responsibility, focuses more on the corporate benefit of corporate social responsibility. And a lot of these perspective approach, or I should put it this way, this perspective and approach really became popular as more researchers started to look at the relationship between social responsibility and financial performance. And there was a lot of investigation on whether or not there was any type of relationship. And some studies did find, to some regard, that the firms that performed better in terms of their social responsibility also tended to have better financial performance. And the arguments for those are, of course, organizations, or I should say consumers, want to buy products and services from organizations they deem to be socially responsible and nice. People would want to work, suppliers would want to give supplies to organizations, again, that are high in terms of CSR. CSR could potentially also help organizations save money. That economic approach, again, has been criticized or questioned because the firm is largely making decisions about its social activity based upon how much it will benefit the self-interest of the organization. So we argue, or we call that an instrumental approach versus the altruistic, which is called a normative and obligatory approach. In this instrumental approach, the firm is deciding who and when who or what it engages with to ensure that whatever its social engagement is, it's going to create the maximum financial success for the firm. And herein lies the problem, because really one can question the validity or credibility or genuineness of that CSR, because if you say, hey, listen, the reason you're doing this is simply to make yourself wealthier, then that's not really socially responsible. That's just, business or wealth maximization, or a strategy to encourage wealth maximization. And then the question becomes, if you see a stakeholder or you see some part of society of not necessarily or directly beneficial to your firm, then you're likely to not prioritize their needs, and you're likely to not engage with them. And then there can be areas of society that will never be helped by organizations simply because those entities do not necessarily affect the bottom line of the firm, or do not affect the bottom line of the firm enough to warrant any type of engagement. So because the economic approach, the self-interest or self-enlightened approach, is so focused or so primarily concerned with the well-being of the firm, it can ignore the social aspect of corporate social responsibility. What we found in today's society, as I said, is almost a compromise of the two. And that approach is called the strategic approach to CSR. And in the strategic approach to CSR, there are elements of both the altruistic approach as well as the economic approach. The element of the altruistic approach is that the organization is motivated or encouraged to consider what the needs of society are. And so it goes out and looks at different areas, and it tries to identify where society has deficits and where the organization where these problems exist. It also encourages the firm to consider itself and its own well-being and find ways to go after or to pursue correcting some of these deficits, filling some of these holes, solving some of these problems, but doing it in a manner that is best aligned with the organization's objectives. So what we have here is the organization pursuing its own goals, but doing that simultaneously with pursuing the goals of society. And it's trying to find areas where it can create what's called shared benefit or shared value. So there might be some areas of society that the organization is best equipped to handle or to focus on because of its specific skills, because of its specific strengths and assets. And in so doing, aligning its strengths with society's needs, it's not only going to promote the well-being of society, but it is also simultaneously and mutually going to benefit itself. And that's what we call the strategic approach. So the firm is going after its own goals, its financial well-being, but it's doing so in a manner that best responds to the needs of society. So the firm is much more focused and also much more selective in terms of how it manages and how it implements its social responsibilities. You essentially see the elements of altruistic, the social consideration, as well as the elements of the economic, the firm consideration. But whereas the altruistic and the altruistic and the economic were all about self or society interests, the strategic is much more about shared interests. So hopefully that kind of gets you thinking about today's CSR. Why have we moved to that? How are firms different? How are they considering their social responsibility in line with their existing business practices? And to get you intrigued to read a little bit more about social responsibility, sustainability, and business ethics.